The rain hammered against the windows of the Flight Simulation Center at Thunderbird Aviation Academy with the relentless rhythm of machine-gun fire. Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching sheets of water cascade down the reinforced panels while lightning split the Nevada sky into jagged fragments of white and purple. Behind her, the gentle hum of 24 state-of-the-art flight simulators filled the cavernous training facility, each cockpit occupied by cadets who believed they understood what it meant to fly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah turned away from the storm and walked between the rows of simulation pods, her weathered flight boots silent against the polished concrete floor. At 38, she carried herself with the precise movements of someone who had spent 15 years in military cockpits before an accident had grounded her permanently. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline caught the blue glow of the simulator displays, a permanent reminder of the ejection that had saved her life but ended her flying career. "Mitchell, throttle control," she called out to Cadet Jennifer Williams, whose simulated F-16 was wobbling through what should have been a routine approach. "Your bird's dancing like a drunk penguin. Smooth inputs, feel the aircraft respond." Jennifer's hands tightened on the controls, her knuckles white against the black joystick grip. The 19-year-old had the highest academic scores in her class, but struggled with the intuitive aspects of flight that couldn't be learned from textbooks. Sarah watched the girl's vitals on the monitoring display and saw the telltale signs of panic beginning to set in. "I can't hold the approach," Jennifer said through gritted teeth. "The crosswind simulation is too strong." Sarah moved to the instructors, CONSOLE, and adjusted the weather parameters, dialing back the wind shear by 15%. She'd learned over 3 years of teaching that breaking a student's confidence served no purpose. There would be plenty of time for harsh reality once they earned their wings. "Try again," Sarah said. "Remember, the aircraft wants to fly. Your job is to guide it, not fight it." This had become her world after the accident, teaching others to soar while she remained forever earthbound. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who could no longer fly had become one of the most respected flight instructors in the Air Force training program. Her students didn't know about the nights she woke up in cold sweats, dreaming of blue sky and the freedom that had been taken from her. They saw only the stern woman who demanded perfection and settled for excellence. The simulation center's main doors hissed open, and Colonel David Brennan entered with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to having his presence acknowledged. At 52, Brennan commanded the entire Thunderbird facility and had been Sarah's commanding officer during her active flying days. He approached her station while Jennifer continued struggling with her landing approach. "Captain Mitchell." "A word," Brennan said, his voice carrying the particular tone that meant official business. Sarah glanced at her students, all deeply engrossed in their simulations, then followed Brennan to a quieter corner of the facility. The colonel's expression was unreadable, but she'd known him long enough to recognize the subtle tension around his eyes that indicated stress. "We have a situation developing," Brennan began without preamble. "Are you familiar with the Aurora project?" Sarah's pulse quickened. Every military pilot had heard whispers about Aurora, the classified stealth aircraft program that officially didn't exist. "Only what everyone knows, sir. Advanced reconnaissance platform, experimental propulsion systems." "What everyone knows is deliberately misleading," Brennan replied. "Aurora isn't reconnaissance. It's a next-generation strike aircraft capable of penetrating any known defense system. The prototype has been undergoing testing at Groom Lake for the past 18 months. The implications hit Sarah immediately. Groom Lake was Area 51, the most secretive military installation in the United States. If Brennan was discussing Aurora openly, something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Sir, Why are you telling me this? Brennan pulled out a tablet and showed her a satellite weather map of the western United States. A massive storm system stretched from California to Colorado, with wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour and cloud tops reaching 60,000 feet. 3 hours ago, Aurora experienced a catastrophic systems failure during a test flight, Brennan explained. The aircraft is currently flying on backup power with limited navigation and communication capabilities. The storm system is moving directly toward Groom Lake, and the pilot needs to get the aircraft to safety before the weather makes landing impossible. Sarah studied the weather data with growing concern. The storm was unlike anything she'd seen in her flying career, a perfect combination of conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots flying conventional aircraft. What does this have to do with me, sir? I'm sure the test pilots at Groom Lake can handle an emergency landing. Brennan's expression grew grim. The test pilot ejected when the primary systems failed. He followed protocol, but Aurora's automated systems engaged and the aircraft continued flying. The backup navigation system is programmed with only one destination that it can reach before the storm hits. Sarah felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. Which is Thunderbird Academy. Aurora's emergency protocols include this facility as a backup landing site due to our extended runway and classified aircraft handling capabilities. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. Aurora was heading toward them, but without a pilot, it would need to be guided down remotely or somehow brought under manual control. Neither option seemed feasible given the approaching storm. Sir, remote landing systems require clear weather and optimal conditions. That storm will interfere with any ground-based guidance systems, which is why we need someone to intercept Aurora and either guide it down or take manual control of the aircraft. Sarah stared at Brennan in disbelief. Colonel, you know my medical status. I'm permanently grounded. The board was very clear about that. The medical board grounded you from routine flight operations due to your inner ear damage from the ejection, Brennan corrected. But they never said you couldn't fly in an emergency situation where your expertise might save lives and critical national security assets. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the scar on her face. The accident had left her with occasional vertigo and balance issues that made her unsuitable for military flying, according to the medical evaluators. But she'd hidden the full extent of her symptoms from everyone, including Brennan. The vertigo episodes had become more frequent over the past year, sometimes leaving her disoriented for minutes at a time. Sir, even if I were medically cleared, Aurora is a classified prototype. I don't have the training or clearance to operate that aircraft. Brennan activated his tablet again, bringing up a technical schematic that made Sarah's breath catch. The Aurora prototype was unlike any aircraft she'd ever seen. Its angular stealth design incorporated propulsion systems that seemed to defy conventional understanding of aerodynamics. Aurora uses a modified flight control system based on the F-22 platform, Brennan explained. The basic flying characteristics should be familiar to any pilot with advanced fighter experience. And Captain Mitchell, your record shows you have more F-22 flight hours than any other pilot currently stationed at this facility. That was true. Before the accident, Sarah had been one of the Air Force's most experienced F-22 pilots with over 800 hours in the aircraft, including test flights of experimental systems. But that felt like a lifetime ago. Colonel, I haven't been in a cockpit for 3 years. My reflexes, my spatial awareness, ... We'll come back, Brennan interrupted. Flying is like breathing for pilots of your caliber. The question is whether you're willing to try. Sarah looked across the simulation center at her students, who were still absorbed in their virtual flights. Jennifer Williams had finally managed a successful approach and was starting another pattern. These young pilots represented the future of American air power, but they were years away from having the experience needed for a mission like this. What exactly are you asking me to do? Brennan switched to a different display showing aircraft specifications. We have a modified T-38 trainer equipped with experimental fly-by-wire systems similar to Aurora's. You would take off, intercept the prototype aircraft, and attempt to establish a data link connection that would allow you to control Aurora remotely. And if the data link doesn't work, Brennan's pause was telling, then you would need to dock with Aurora and transfer into its cockpit. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Aerial docking was an incredibly dangerous maneuver under optimal conditions. Attempting it during a storm with an experimental aircraft would be borderline suicidal. Sir, with all due respect, that's not a rescue mission. That's a desperate gamble with extremely low probability of success. You're right, Brennan admitted. But Aurora contains technology that cannot be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. If the aircraft crashes in populated areas or is recovered by foreign intelligence services, the consequences for national security would be catastrophic. Sarah understood the subtext. This wasn't just about saving an experimental aircraft. Aurora represented billions of dollars in research and development, along with technological advantages that kept America ahead of its adversaries. If the prototype was lost or captured, it could shift the global balance of power. What about other pilots? Surely there are active duty pilots with more recent experience who could attempt this. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm system is moving too fast, Brennan replied. By the time we could bring in pilots from other installations, Aurora will either have crashed or been forced to attempt an automated landing in impossible conditions. You're here, you have the experience, and you know this facility better than anyone. Sarah walked back to the window and watched the storm approaching. The wind had intensified, causing the trees around the facility to bend at alarming angles. In the distance, she could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves around the runway, their lights flashing against the dark sky. How long do I have to decide? Brennan checked his watch. Aurora will be within intercept range in 90 minutes. The storm will reach us in 2 hours. If you're going to do this, we need to start preparations immediately. Sarah thought about the 15 years she'd spent in military cockpits, the countless hours perfecting her skills, and the accident that had ended it all. She'd spent 3 years teaching others to fly while fighting the constant ache of being grounded. This might be her only chance to return to the sky, even if it might also be her last. If I do this, I want full disclosure about Aurora's capabilities and limitations. I want to review every piece of technical data you have on the aircraft. Done. And I want a full medical team standing by. If I experience vertigo or any other symptoms during the flight, I need to be able to abort the mission immediately. Agreed. Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. Colonel, I'll need 30 minutes to brief my replacement for the training session and review Aurora's flight characteristics. Brennan nodded grimly. Captain Mitchell, I want you to know that this is completely voluntary. No one will question your decision if you choose not to attempt this mission. Sarah looked at her students one more time, then at the storm approaching through the window. Sir, I've been grounded for 3 years. If there's a chance I can get back in the cockpit and serve my country at the same time, I have to take it. As Brennan left to coordinate the mission preparations, Sarah remained at the window watching the lightning flash across the desert. She'd told her students that aircraft wanted to fly, that a pilot's job was to guide rather than fight. Tonight, she would discover whether those principles applied to her as well. The rain continued hammering against the glass, but for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell wasn't watching the storm from the ground. She was preparing to fly into it. The classified briefing room beneath Thunderbird Academy hummed with urgent activity as technicians wheeled and secure communication equipment and multiple high-resolution displays. Sarah had never been in this underground facility during her 3 years as an instructor, though she'd suspected its existence. The reinforced concrete walls and multiple security checkpoints suggested capabilities far beyond what a typical training facility required. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the facility's chief medical officer, attached monitoring sensors to Sarah's temples while reviewing her medical file on a tablet. The 45-year-old physician had been briefed on the mission parameters and was clearly concerned about clearing someone with Sarah's medical history for active flight operations. "Captain Mitchell, your last flight was 37 months ago," Dr. Chen said, adjusting the electrode placement. "Since then, you've reported 3 incidents of severe vertigo and ongoing balance issues. What makes you think you can handle high-stress combat maneuvering?" Sarah kept her expression neutral while the medical sensors calibrated. She hadn't reported 3 incidents of vertigo. She'd reported 3 incidents to maintain the appearance of honesty while concealing at least a dozen others. The episodes had become more frequent and severe over the past year, sometimes lasting up to 20 minutes. "Doctor, the vertigo episodes have been decreasing in frequency," Sarah lied smoothly. "And they've never occurred during high-concentration activities. They seem to be triggered by fatigue or stress, not by complex motor functions." Dr. Chun's skeptical expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she continued the medical evaluation. "We're going to monitor your inner ear function, stress hormones, and neurological responses throughout the mission preparation. If any readings indicate compromised performance capability, I'm pulling you from this operation regardless of mission priorities." Colonel Brennan entered the briefing room followed by Major Lisa Rodriguez, a diminutive woman in her early 30s, who carried herself with the confident air of someone accustomed to working with classified technology. Rodriguez approached a bank of computers and began initializing secure data feeds from multiple intelligence sources. "Captain Mitchell, Major Rodriguez is our specialist in experimental aircraft systems," Brennan announced. "She's been working with the Aurora program since its inception and will be coordinating your mission from the ground." Rodriguez looked up from her computers with piercing brown eyes that seemed to evaluate Sarah with clinical precision. "Captain, I need to understand your comfort level with unconventional flight dynamics. Aurora doesn't behave like traditional aircraft. The propulsion system creates thrust vectoring capabilities that can be disorienting for pilots trained on CONVENTIONAL platforms." Sarah studied the technical readouts appearing on Rodriguez's displays. The Aurora prototype incorporated propulsion technology that seemed to blur the line between aerodynamic flight and something approaching anti-gravity manipulation. The thrust-to-weight ratios were unlike anything she'd encountered in 15 years of military flying. "Major, I've flown experimental variants of most current Air Force platforms," Sarah replied. "I understand that new technology requires adaptation, but the fundamental principles of flight dynamics should remain consistent." Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with Colonel Brennan before responding. "Captain Aurora operates on principles that extend beyond conventional flight dynamics. The aircraft can achieve sustained flight at angles of attack that would cause traditional jets to stall immediately. It can also perform vector changes that generate g-forces exceeding human tolerance levels." The implications were staggering. If Aurora could maneuver beyond the physical limitations of human pilots, it represented a quantum leap in aircraft design philosophy. But it also meant that flying the aircraft would require completely different thinking about aerodynamics and combat tactics. "How does the pilot survive g-forces that exceed human tolerance?" Sarah asked. "The cockpit incorporates inertial dampening technology that reduces the pilot's experience of acceleration forces," Rodriguez explained. "However, The system requires precise coordination between pilot inputs and automated responses. If the pilot fights the aircraft's natural tendencies, the inertial dampening becomes ineffective. Dr. Chun looked up from her medical monitoring equipment with obvious concern. Major Rodriguez, are you saying that this aircraft can kill its pilot if operated incorrectly? That's exactly what I'm saying, Rodriguez confirmed. Aurora has already been responsible for one pilot fatality during testing. The aircraft's capabilities exceed current training protocols and safety margins. Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She'd assumed the ejected test pilot had followed standard emergency procedures, but the reality was more complex. The pilot had ejected because continuing to fly Aurora would have been fatal. What happened to the pilot who was killed? Sarah asked. Brennan answered grimly. Major Thompson attempted to perform evasive maneuvers during a simulated combat scenario. He exceeded the aircraft's safe operating parameters and experienced G-forces that caused catastrophic physiological failure before the inertial dampening could compensate. Sarah processed this information while watching technical specifications scroll across Rodriguez's displays. Aurora wasn't just an experimental aircraft. It was a prototype that pushed the boundaries of what human pilots could survive. Flying it successfully would require not just skill, but precise understanding of limitations that were still being discovered. Colonel, given these safety concerns, wouldn't a remote guidance system be preferable to putting another pilot at risk? Rodriguez shook her head. The storm system approaching our location will interfere with any ground-based control signals. Aurora's own communication systems were damaged during the initial system's failure. Remote guidance isn't feasible under current conditions. Dr. Chun finished her initial medical evaluation and reviewed the sensor data on her tablet. Captain Mitchell, your baseline readings are within acceptable ranges, but I'm seeing elevated stress hormones and some irregular inner ear responses. Are you experiencing any symptoms currently? Sarah was experiencing mild dizziness but attributing it to stress seemed reasonable. Nothing beyond normal pre-mission anxiety, Doctor. I want continuous monitoring throughout the preparation phase, Dr. Chun decided. Any indication of vertigo or balance issues, and we abort immediately. Major Rodriguez activated a large wall display showing real-time tracking data for the Aurora prototype. The aircraft appeared as a blue triangle moving steadily across a map of the western United States, with the massive storm system represented as a swirling red mass approaching from the Pacific Ocean. Aurora is currently maintaining level flight at 45,000 feet, Rodriguez reported. Backup navigation systems are guiding it toward our location, but the aircraft's fuel reserves are limited. We estimate 90 minutes of flight, time remaining before emergency reserves are engaged. Sarah studied Aurora's flight path and projected intercept coordinates. The mathematics were complex but achievable. Her modified T-38 would need to climb to Aurora's altitude and match its speed while attempting to establish the data link connection. What's the procedure if the data link fails to establish? Sarah asked. Rodriguez brought up a different display showing technical diagrams of both aircraft. The T-38 has been modified with a docking collar that can interface with Aurora's emergency access port. You would need to maneuver your aircraft into precise alignment and physically dock with the prototype. The technical challenge was enormous. Aerial docking required matching not just speed and altitude, but exact positioning within inches while both aircraft were traveling at several hundred miles per hour. Attempting the maneuver during a storm would be exponentially more difficult. Major, what's the margin for error on the docking procedure? Less than 6 inches in any direction, Rodriguez admitted. The docking collar has some tolerance for minor variations, but significant misalignment would result in collision between the aircraft. Dr. Chun looked up from her medical monitoring with alarm. You're asking Captain Mitchell to perform a maneuver that could result in a catastrophic collision if executed imprecisely. "Doctor, every aspect of this mission involves significant risk," Brennan interjected. "The alternative is allowing Aurora to crash with potentially much worse consequences." Sarah walked to the wall display and traced Aurora's projected flight path with her finger. The aircraft would pass directly over several populated areas before reaching Thunderbird Academy. If it crashed in any of those locations, the casualties could be substantial, not to mention the security implications of losing the classified technology. "Colonel, what happens after I establish contact with Aurora? What's the plan for getting both aircraft safely on the ground?" "That depends on the aircraft's condition when you intercept it," Brennan replied. "If Aurora's systems are stable enough for remote guidance, you can shepherd it to our runway and land normally. If the prototype requires manual piloting, you would need to transfer into Aurora's cockpit and fly it down yourself." The complexity kept escalating. Sarah had assumed the mission involved intercepting Aurora and guiding it to safety. The reality included the possibility of transferring between aircraft at altitude during a storm, then landing an experimental aircraft she'd never flown. "Sir, transferring between aircraft during flight isn't a standard procedure. How exactly would that work?" Major Rodriguez activated another display showing detailed schematics of the proposed transfer procedure. Both aircraft would need to maintain precise formation flying while you egress from the T-38 and ingress to Aurora through the docking collar. The entire transfer would need to be completed within approximately 60 seconds to minimize exposure to outside conditions. Sarah stared at the diagrams in disbelief. The procedure resembled something from a science fiction movie rather than actual military operations. Transferring between aircraft during flight had been attempted experimentally, but never under operational conditions, and certainly never during severe weather. "Major, has this transfer procedure ever been tested successfully?" "In simulator environments only," Rodriguez admitted. "Real-world testing was scheduled for next month under controlled conditions." Dr. Chun stood up abruptly, her medical equipment still monitoring Sarah's vital signs. "This is insane. You're asking someone with documented medical issues to attempt experimental procedures that have never been tested in reality. Dr. Aurora contains technology worth billions of dollars and represents strategic advantages that took decades to develop," Brennan countered. "The risks to Captain Mitchell are significant, but the potential consequences of losing Aurora are catastrophic." Sarah studied the mission parameters while considering her options. The technical challenges were enormous, the safety margins were minimal, and her medical condition was worse than anyone knew. But she also understood the strategic implications. Aurora represented the future of American air superiority. Losing it would set back military aviation development by years or decades. "Colonel, I need to understand Aurora's flight characteristics before making a final decision," Sarah said. "If I'm going to fly an aircraft I've never seen, I need comprehensive technical training." Rodriguez nodded and began initializing the sophisticated flight simulator that had been concealed behind sliding panels in the briefing room wall. "We have a full Aurora simulation system that incorporates all known flight characteristics and system limitations." As the simulator powered up, Sarah noticed that her hands were trembling slightly. Whether from anxiety, medical issues, or anticipation, she couldn't tell. But for the first time in 3 years, she was about to experience flight again, even if only in simulation. Dr. Chen approached with a concerned expression. "Captain, your stress hormone levels are elevated beyond normal ranges. I'm also detecting minor irregularities in your inner ear responses that suggest possible onset of vertigo symptoms." Sarah looked at the Aurora simulator, then at the wall display showing the approaching storm system. In 60 minutes, she would need to make the most important decision of her military career. She could remain safely on the ground and watch Aurora crash or risk everything for a chance to save both the aircraft and her own sense of purpose. Doctor, monitor my responses during the simulation, Sarah decided. If I show signs of medical compromise, we'll abort the mission. But I need to understand what I'm being asked to do before making that choice. As Sarah approached the Aurora simulator, she felt the familiar surge of anticipation that had driven her through 15 years of military flying. For 3 years, she'd watched others pursue their dreams of flight while remaining grounded. Tonight, she might finally return to the sky. Even if the journey proved to be her last dot, the Aurora simulator cockpit differed dramatically from any aircraft Sarah had experienced. Instead of traditional analog gauges and mechanical switches, the entire instrument panel consisted of holographic displays that seemed to float in three-dimensional space around the pilot's position. The control stick felt wrong in her hands, too light, too responsive, as if it were connected to the aircraft systems through some form of neural interface rather than mechanical linkages. Initialize startup sequence, Major Rodriguez instructed. Through the simulator's communication system, Aurora's power-up procedures are unlike conventional aircraft. The fusion reactor requires a specific initialization pattern to achieve stable operation. Sarah studied the holographic displays as they materialized around her. The startup checklist contained procedures she'd never encountered, involving plasma containment fields, gravitational field generators, and exotic matter fuel injection systems. This wasn't just an advanced aircraft, it was technology that seemed decades ahead of anything in the current military inventory. Major, these systems references gravitational field manipulation. Are we talking about actual gravity control? Rodriguez's voice carried a note of excitement despite the mission's urgency. Aurora incorporates breakthrough discoveries in theoretical physics. The aircraft doesn't just push against air for lift and propulsion. It manipulates local gravitational fields to achieve flight characteristics that would be impossible using conventional aerodynamics. As Sarah worked through the startup sequence, she felt a disturbing sensation of disorientation. The simulator was incredibly sophisticated, but something about Aurora's flight dynamics triggered responses in her inner ear that felt wrong. The aircraft seemed to accelerate and maneuver without creating the expected sensations of movement. I'm experiencing unusual physiological responses, Sarah reported to Dr. Chun, who was monitoring her medical data from outside the simulator. The aircraft's movement doesn't correlate with what my inner ear expects. Dr. Chun's voice came through the intercom with obvious concern. Captain, your inner ear readings show significant confusion patterns. The gravitational field manipulation is affecting your balance centers in ways that conventional flight doesn't. Sarah gripped the control stick more firmly as the simulated Aurora climbed through virtual clouds. The aircraft responded to her inputs, but the feedback felt alien. When she applied back pressure on the stick, the aircraft climbed, but she experienced no sensation of increased G-forces. When she initiated turns, the aircraft rotated smoothly without the expected feelings of centrifugal force. This is going to take significant adaptation, Sarah admitted. My brain keeps expecting normal flight sensations that aren't occurring. That's exactly why Aurora has been so difficult to master, Rodriguez explained. Human pilots rely heavily on inner ear feedback to maintain spatial orientation. Aurora's gravitational field manipulation eliminates many of those sensations, which can lead to severe disorientation. Sarah attempted a series of basic maneuvers while fighting growing nausea. The aircraft performed perfectly, executing turns and climbs that would have been impossible in conventional jets, but her body rebelled against the conflicting sensory inputs. After 20 minutes in the simulator, she was experiencing significant vertigo despite the aircraft's stable flight. Dr. Chun, I need to exit the simulator, Sarah announced. The disorientation is becoming severe. As the simulator powered Down, Sarah struggled to maintain her balance while exiting the cockpit. The room seemed to tilt around her, and she had to grip the handrails to prevent falling. Dr. Chun immediately approached with medical scanning equipment, while Colonel Brennan watched with growing concern. "Captain, your inner ear function shows significant disruption," Dr. Chun reported after completing her scans. "The gravitational field effects are creating conflicts between your visual inputs and balance centers. This level of disorientation would be dangerous during actual flight." Operations. Sarah sat heavily in a nearby chair, waiting for the vertigo to subside. The simulation had revealed a fundamental problem with the mission. Even if her medical condition had been perfect, Aurora's unusual flight characteristics would challenge any pilot's ability to maintain spatial orientation. "Major Rodriguez, how did the previous Aurora pilots handle these orientation issues?" Rodriguez consulted her technical files before answering. "Major Thompson, the pilot who was killed, experienced similar problems during his initial training. The solution involved extensive simulation time to desensitize the inner ear to Aurora's unusual characteristics. Unfortunately, that training typically requires weeks or months to complete." Colonel Brennan checked his watch with obvious frustration. "We don't have weeks or months. Aurora will be within intercept range in 40 minutes, and the storm system is intensifying. Captain Mitchell, can you adapt to Aurora's flight characteristics quickly enough to complete the mission?" Sarah closed her eyes and concentrated on regaining her equilibrium. The vertigo was subsiding, but the experience had revealed the true scope of the challenge. Flying Aurora wouldn't just require technical skill, it would demand overcoming fundamental physiological responses that had been developed through millions of years of human evolution. "Colonel, I need to understand something," Sarah said. "If Aurora is so difficult to fly that it requires months of specialized training, how did you expect me to master it in a few hours?" The uncomfortable silence that followed suggested Sarah had identified a critical flaw in the mission planning. Rodriguez finally spoke, her voice reluctant. "Captain, we were hoping that your extensive experience with experimental aircraft would allow for accelerated adaptation. The alternative scenarios for dealing with Aurora are problematic." "What alternative scenarios?" Brennan activated a classified display showing military response options. "If Aurora cannot be recovered safely, we may need to destroy it to prevent the technology from falling into the wrong hands. That would involve deploying fighter aircraft to shoot down Aurora before it crashes in populated areas." The implications were staggering. Aurora represented billions of dollars in research and development, along with technological breakthroughs that could revolutionize military aviation. Destroying it would set back American air superiority by decades, while potentially allowing adversaries to close the technological gap. "Sir, destroying Aurora would eliminate our only operational example of this technology. How long would it take to build another prototype?" "Assuming we could secure funding and political support after losing the first prototype, at least 15 years, Rodriguez admitted. "Many of the theoretical breakthroughs that made Aurora possible took decades to achieve. We might not be able to recreate them." Sarah stood up carefully, testing her balance before walking to the displays showing Aurora's current position. The aircraft was maintaining stable flight, but its fuel reserves were diminishing steadily. In 30 minutes, it would enter the outer edges of the storm system. In 60 minutes, it would reach Thunderbird Academy's airspace. "Major Rodriguez, is there any way to modify Aurora's gravitational field systems to reduce the disorientation?" "Effects?" Rodriguez studied her technical readouts for several minutes before responding. "Theoretically, yes. Aurora's field generators can be calibrated to provide more conventional flight sensations. However, reducing the gravitational manipulation would also reduce the aircraft's performance capabilities." "How much reduction are we talking about?" "Approximately 60% degradation in maneuverability and acceleration capabilities," Rodriguez calculated. Aurora would still outperform conventional aircraft, but it would lose many of its unique advantages. Dr. Chen looked up from her medical monitoring equipment with a thoughtful expression. "Captain, if Aurora's gravitational effects were reduced, your inner ear responses might be manageable. The disorientation you experienced was primarily due to the complete absence of expected acceleration forces." Sarah weighed the options while studying Aurora's approach trajectory. Flying the aircraft at reduced capability would be challenging but potentially feasible. However, landing Aurora during the storm would still require precision that might exceed her current abilities. "There's another factor we need to consider," Sarah said. "Even if I can adapt to Aurora's flight characteristics, landing an experimental aircraft during severe weather conditions presents enormous risks. What's the backup plan if I can't complete a safe landing?" Brennan's expression grew even more grim. Aurora's runway requirements are more stringent than conventional aircraft due to its unique propulsion systems. Thunderbird Academy has the only runway within range that can accommodate Aurora's landing needs. There's no backup airfield. "So, if I can't land Aurora here, the aircraft crashes regardless." "That's correct." Sarah walked back to the Aurora simulator, considering the impossible decision she faced. Attempting the mission meant risking her life on experimental procedures that had never been tested under operational conditions. Refusing the mission meant watching Aurora crash and losing technology that represented America's future air superiority. "Colonel, I need to make a call to someone before I decide." Brennan looked surprised. "Captain, this is a classified operation. We can't authorize external communications." "Sir, I need to call my sister in Colorado. She's a neurologist who specializes in inner ear disorders. If anyone can help me understand how to manage the physiological challenges of flying Aurora, it's her." Rodriguez consulted her security protocols before nodding. "We can authorize a secure communication if the conversation remains focused on medical consultation rather than operational details." 5 minutes later, Sarah was connected to Dr. Amy Mitchell through an encrypted communication system. Her younger sister's face appeared on a secure video screen, showing a woman who shared Sarah's determined expression but lacked the weathered look that came from years of military service. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look terrible," and calling me on a secure military line suggests something serious is happening. Sarah chose her words carefully, avoiding classified details while explaining her medical situation. "Amy, I'm facing a flight situation that involves unusual sensory inputs. Aircraft systems that eliminate normal acceleration feedback. I'm experiencing severe vertigo and disorientation." Amy's expression grew professional as she considered the medical implications. "Sarah, your inner ear damage from the ejection makes you particularly susceptible to spatial disorientation. If you're facing unusual sensory environments, the risks could be severe." "What kind of unusual sensory inputs?" Sarah glanced at Colonel Brennan, who nodded permission to provide limited technical details. "Gravitational field manipulation that eliminates normal flight sensations. The aircraft maneuvers without creating expected acceleration forces." Amy was quiet for a long moment, her medical training processing the implications. "Sarah, that kind of sensory conflict could trigger severe vertigo episodes in anyone, but especially dangerous for someone with your medical history. Are you sure you need to do this?" "Amy, I can't explain the details, but this is important. National security is important. Is there any way to manage the physiological responses?" "Potentially," Amy replied thoughtfully. "There are medications that can suppress inner ear responses temporarily. Beta blockers combined with specialized anti-vertigo compounds might help. But Sarah, those medications also affect reaction time and spatial awareness. You'd be trading one set of problems for another." Dr. Chun had been monitoring the conversation and leaned forward with interest. "Dr. Mitchell, What kind of side effects would those medications produce? Reduced reaction time, possible depth perception issues, and some cognitive dulling, Amy explained. The medications would help with vertigo, but they'd also impair the precise motor control needed for complex flying tasks. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her decision. Flying Aurora without medication meant risking severe disorientation. Flying with medication meant accepting impaired reflexes. Either choice carried enormous risks during a mission that already pushed the boundaries of human capability. Amy, if someone had to choose between vertigo episodes and reduced reaction time for a critical flight situation, which would you recommend? Amy's expression grew troubled. Sarah, I can't recommend either option for someone with your medical history. Both choices present unacceptable risks for complex aviation operations. But if there was no choice, if someone had to pick one or the other, Amy sighed deeply. The anti-vertigo medication would be safer in the short term. Vertigo episodes can be completely incapacitating, while medication side effects are more predictable and manageable. After ending the call with her sister, Sarah turned to face the assembled team. Dr. Chen was preparing medication based on Amy's recommendations. Major Rodriguez was finalizing Aurora's technical modifications, and Colonel Brennan was monitoring the approaching storm system. Colonel, I've made my decision, Sarah announced. I'll attempt the mission with the understanding that both Aurora and I will be operating with reduced capabilities. Aurora's gravitational systems will be modified to provide more conventional flight sensations, and I'll use medication to manage vertigo risks. Captain, are you certain about this choice? Dr. Chun asked. The combination of experimental aircraft, severe weather, and medication side effects creates multiple layers of risk. Sarah looked at the display showing Aurora's position relative to the storm system. The prototype aircraft was beautiful in its alien design, representing humanity's reach toward technologies that seemed almost magical. Losing it would be more than a military setback. It would be the loss of humanity's next evolutionary step in flight. Dr. Chun, 3 years ago I was told I'd never fly again. Tonight, I have the opportunity to pilot the most advanced aircraft ever built. The risks are enormous, but so are the potential consequences of failure. As the team began final mission preparations, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror that she hadn't experienced since her first combat deployment. In 20 minutes, she would climb into a modified T-38 and attempt to intercept an experimental aircraft during one of the most severe storms in recent history. For the first time in 3 years, Captain Sarah Mitchell was going back to war. This time, her enemy wasn't a foreign military. It was the storm, the technology, and her own damaged body. But she was finally going to fly again. The modified T-38 Talon sat on Thunderbird Academy's runway like a predator poised to strike. Sarah approached the aircraft through driving rain that stung her face despite the protective flight suit. The anti-vertigo medication Dr. Chun had administered 20 minutes earlier was already affecting her depth perception, making the aircraft appear slightly out of focus at the edges of her vision. Chief Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, the facility's senior aircraft maintenance specialist, completed his final inspection of the T-38's experimental systems. At 58, Hayes had worked on more classified aircraft modifications than anyone at Thunderbird, but even he seemed nervous about tonight's configuration. Captain Mitchell, this bird's been modified with systems I've never seen before, Hayes reported, his weathered hands checking connections on equipment that seemed more suited to a space program than military aviation. The docking collar assembly adds 1,400 pounds to your gross weight, and the gravitational field sensors are completely untested in flight operations. Sarah examined the T-38's modifications while fighting the medication's effects on her spatial awareness. The docking collar protruded from the aircraft's belly like a mechanical proboscis, while additional antennas and sensor arrays covered surfaces that had been smooth just hours earlier. Sergeant Hayes, how do these modifications affect the aircraft's flight characteristics? Honestly, ma'am, we don't know, Hayes admitted. The engineers ran computer simulations, but there wasn't time for actual flight testing. You're going to be the test pilot for experimental systems during what amounts to a combat mission. The implications were sobering. Sarah would be flying an aircraft that had been fundamentally altered using untested technology while attempting to intercept another experimental aircraft during severe weather conditions. The margins for error were essentially non-existent. Major Rodriguez approached through the storm, her tablet computer protected by a waterproof case. Captain, Aurora's position has shifted slightly due to wind drift from the storm system. We're updating your intercept coordinates now. Sarah studied the new flight path on Rodriguez's display. Aurora was still maintaining its programmed course toward Thunderbird Academy, but the massive storm was affecting its trajectory in ways the backup navigation system couldn't compensate for perfectly. Major, what's Aurora's current altitude and airspeed? 47,000 feet, maintaining 420 knots, Rodriguez replied. The aircraft is operating on backup power, so its performance is reduced from normal specifications. Sarah calculated intercept parameters while her modified spatial awareness struggled with the mathematics. The anti-vertigo medication was definitely affecting her cognitive processing, but the alternative of experiencing vertigo during complex maneuvering would be worse. Colonel Brennan, I need to understand the communication protocols for this mission, Sarah said as the base commander approached through the rain. How do I establish contact with Aurora? And what are my options if the data link fails? Brennan activated a ruggedized tablet showing communication frequencies and emergency procedures. Aurora responds to encrypted signals on 3 backup frequencies. If you can establish a data link connection, you'll be able to control the aircraft remotely, using the modified systems in your T-38. And if the data link doesn't work, then you proceed to the docking procedure we discussed, Brennan replied grimly. But Captain, I want to emphasize that the aircraft transfer has never been attempted under operational conditions. If you experience any problems during the approach, abort immediately and return to base. Sarah nodded while climbing into the T-38's cockpit. The familiar layout of switches and displays provided some comfort, but the additional equipment for controlling Aurora made the workspace feel cramped and unfamiliar. She began working through the modified pre-flight checklist while ground crews made final preparations. Phoenix Control, this is Angel 7 requesting clearance for an emergency intercept mission. Sarah radioed to the tower. Angel 7, Phoenix Control. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Runway 27. Be advised, surface winds are gusting to 60 knots with severe turbulence reported above 15,000 feet. Sarah acknowledged the clearance while starting the T-38's engines. The modified aircraft felt different during engine startup, heavier and less responsive than the trainer she was accustomed to flying. The additional weight of the docking equipment was noticeable even during ground operations. Dr. Chien's voice came through the communication system as Sarah prepared for takeoff. Captain, your medical telemetry shows stable vital signs, but I'm monitoring for any changes that might indicate medication side effects or vertigo onset. Understood, Doc. How long do I have before the medication's effectiveness begins to diminish? Approximately 90 minutes of peak effectiveness, then gradual decline over the following hour, Dr. Chun replied. If this mission extends beyond 2 hours, you'll need to consider the risks of operating without medical support. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the T-38 begin its takeoff roll. The aircraft accelerated normally despite its additional weight, lifting off into the turbulent air above Thunderbird Academy. As soon as the landing gear retracted, Sarah encountered the storm's outer edges. The turbulence was unlike anything she'd experienced during 3 years of instruction flights. The modified T-38 bucked and rolled in the violent air currents, while rain hammered against the canopy with enough force to reduce visibility to mere hundreds of feet. Sarah fought to maintain control while climbing toward Aurora's altitude. Angel 7, be advised that Aurora has altered course slightly, Major Rodriguez radioed. New intercept coordinates are being transmitted to your navigation system. Sarah acknowledged while struggling with the aircraft's handling characteristics in the severe weather. The modifications had shifted the T-38's center of gravity, making it less stable in turbulence. Every gust of wind seemed to threaten the aircraft's structural integrity. At 25,000 feet, Sarah broke through the storm's lower cloud deck into a bizarre twilight world between weather layers. Above her, the clouds rose like mountainous peaks touched with lightning, while below, the storm raged with winds that could tear conventional aircraft apart. Angel 7, Aurora is on radar contact bearing 045, range 60 miles. The controller reported. Target is maintaining course and altitude. Sarah turned toward the intercept heading, while activating the experimental sensor systems that would allow her to detect Aurora's advanced stealth characteristics. The displays showed confusing readouts as the equipment attempted to track an aircraft designed to be invisible to conventional detection methods. 15 minutes into the flight, Sarah achieved visual contact with Aurora. The experimental aircraft appeared as a dark triangle against the storm clouds, its angular stealth design making it seem more like a piece of origami than a flying machine. Aurora was maintaining steady flight, but Sarah could see that its navigation lights were flickering irregularly, evidence of the electrical problems that had forced the original pilot to eject. Phoenix Control, this is Angel 7. I have visual contact with Aurora. Beginning approach for data link establishment. Sarah maneuvered the T-38 into formation with Aurora while fighting the storm's turbulence. The experimental aircraft was larger than she'd expected, with a wingspan nearly twice that of her T-38. More importantly, Aurora seemed to be flying with unnatural stability despite the severe weather conditions surrounding both aircraft. Angel 7, activate data link transmission, Major Rodriguez instructed. Aurora should respond automatically if its communication systems are functional. Sarah engaged the experimental communication equipment while maintaining formation with Aurora. The displays showed transmission signals being sent, but no response from the prototype aircraft. After 5 minutes of attempts, it became clear that Aurora's communication systems were too damaged to establish the data link. Phoenix Control, data link establishment has failed, Sarah reported. Aurora is not responding to transmission attempts. Proceeding to the docking procedure. The acknowledgement from ground control carried obvious tension. Everyone understood that the docking maneuver represented the most dangerous aspect of the entire mission. Sarah would need to precisely align her aircraft's docking collar with Aurora's emergency access port while both aircraft flew through severe turbulence. Sarah gradually closed the distance between the two aircraft while studying Aurora's construction. Details. The emergency access port was located on Aurora's lower fuselage, approximately 20 feet behind the cockpit. The port was designed to accept the T-38's docking collar, but achieving the precise alignment would require flying skills that pushed the boundaries of human capability. Angel 7, be advised that weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, the controller warned. You have approximately 30 minutes before the storm's center reaches your position. Sarah acknowledged while beginning the delicate process of maneuvering her aircraft beneath Aurora's fuselage. The turbulence made precise flying nearly impossible, with both aircraft bouncing unpredictably in the violent air currents. She had to anticipate Aurora's movements while compensating for her own aircraft's instability. As she positioned the T-38 directly below Aurora, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Aurora's emergency access port was sealed, and there was no obvious way to open it from the outside. The docking procedure assumed that Aurora's pilot would activate the access port from inside the aircraft. "Phoenix Control, I have a problem," Sarah radioed urgently. "Aurora's emergency access port appears to be sealed. There's no external activation mechanism visible." The radio silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds before Major Rodriguez responded. "Angel 7, stand by. We're checking technical documentation for alternative access procedures." Sarah maintained formation with Aurora while waiting for instructions, but her fuel reserves were diminishing steadily. The T-38's modified configuration reduced fuel efficiency, and fighting the storm's turbulence was consuming fuel at an alarming rate. "Angel 7, according to Aurora's technical specifications, the emergency access port should open automatically when it detects a properly configured docking collar in close proximity," Rodriguez finally reported. Sarah carefully positioned her aircraft so that the docking collar was within inches of Aurora's access port. The proximity required flying skills that she hadn't used since her most challenging test pilot assignments, made more difficult by the medication's effects on her depth perception. After several minutes of precise maneuvering, Aurora's emergency access port finally opened with a mechanical grinding noise that was audible even over the storm. Sarah felt a surge of relief as she realized the docking procedure might actually be possible. But as she began the final approach to connect the docking collar with Aurora's access port, a massive downdraft caught both aircraft. The T-38 dropped suddenly, while Aurora's advanced flight systems kept it stable. Sarah found herself separated from Aurora by nearly 100 feet of turbulent air. "Angel 7, what's your status?" Dr. Chun's voice carried obvious concern as she monitored Sarah's medical telemetry. "Still operational, but this weather is making precise maneuvering extremely difficult," Sarah replied while climbing back toward Aurora's position. "The medication is helping with vertigo, but my depth perception is definitely compromised." Sarah made 3 more attempts to dock with Aurora, each time being frustrated by the storm's unpredictable turbulence. Her fuel reserves were reaching critical levels, and the anti-vertigo medication was beginning to affect her reaction time more noticeably. On her 4th approach, Sarah managed to achieve contact between the docking collar and Aurora's access port. The mechanical connection engaged with a solid thunk that she felt through the T-38's airframe. For the first time since beginning the mission, she allowed herself to hope that the impossible might be achievable. "Phoenix Control, docking connection achieved," Sarah reported, beginning pressurization of the transfer tunnel. But as the tunnel pressurized, Aurora suddenly pitched upward violently, breaking the docking connection and sending both aircraft tumbling through the turbulent air. Sarah fought to regain control of her T-38, while Aurora's automated systems struggled to compensate for the sudden disruption. "Angel 7, Aurora's flight systems appear to be malfunctioning," Major Rodriguez reported urgently. "The aircraft is entering an uncontrolled climb that could result in structural failure." Sarah watched in horror as Aurora climbed rapidly through the storm clouds, its automated systems apparently confused by the docking attempt. The experimental aircraft was heading toward altitude levels that would exceed its operational limits, potentially causing catastrophic structural failure. For the first time since beginning the mission, Sarah realized that she might not be trying to save Aurora. She might be trying to save everyone below from the wreckage of humanity's most advanced aircraft falling from the sky. Aurora climbed through the storm clouds like a metallic ghost, its angular silhouette disappearing and reappearing between lightning strikes that illuminated the aircraft's desperate ascent. Sarah pushed her T-38 to its operational limits, chasing the runaway prototype while her fuel gauge dropped toward emergency reserves. The anti-vertigo medication was wearing off faster than expected, leaving her with increasingly frequent waves of disorientation. "Angel 7, Aurora has exceeded 55,000 feet and is still climbing," Major Rodriguez reported from ground control. At this rate, the aircraft will reach its structural ceiling within 6 minutes. Sarah fought through a bout of dizziness while calculating intercept angles. Aurora's uncontrolled climb was taking it beyond the operational envelope of most military aircraft, but the T-38's modifications might allow her to follow, if she was willing to risk structural failure of her own aircraft. Phoenix Control, what's Aurora's maximum operational altitude? 78,000 feet, Rodriguez replied grimly. But the prototype has never been tested at those altitudes during emergency conditions. The gravitational field generators might destabilize if the aircraft exceeds design parameters. Sarah understood the implications. If Aurora's gravitational systems failed at extreme altitude, the aircraft would become an unguided projectile falling toward populated areas below. The experimental technology that made Aurora revolutionary could also make its destruction catastrophic. Angel 7. Be advised that ground-based radar has lost contact with Aurora, the air traffic controller announced. The aircraft's stealth systems are interfering with our ability to track its position above 50,000 feet. Sarah was now flying blind, chasing an invisible aircraft through the most violent storm system in recent memory. Her only reference points were occasional lightning flashes that revealed Aurora's position, and the experimental sensors in her T-38 that provided sporadic readings through the electromagnetic interference dot at 58,000 feet. Sarah's T-38 began experiencing structural stress warnings. The aircraft wasn't designed for sustained flight at these altitudes, and the modifications had reduced its safety margins even further. Red warning lights illuminated her instrument panel as multiple systems approached their operational limits. Angel 7. Your aircraft is approaching critical altitude limits. Dr. Chun's voice carried obvious concern as she monitored Sarah's medical and aircraft telemetry. Recommend immediate descent to safe operating altitude. Negative, Phoenix Control. Aurora is still climbing, and I'm the only asset in position to intercept. Sarah's response was strained as she fought both the aircraft's handling difficulties and her own increasing medical symptoms through a gap. In the storm clouds, Sarah caught sight of Aurora again. The experimental aircraft was no longer climbing steadily. It was oscillating wildly between different altitudes as its automated systems struggled to maintain control. The gravitational field generators seemed to be malfunctioning, creating unpredictable flight behavior that defied conventional aerodynamics. Phoenix Control, I have visual contact with Aurora again. The aircraft appears to be experiencing severe flight control problems. Its movement patterns are completely erratic. Angel 7, can you determine Aurora's heading or predict its flight path? Sarah studied Aurora's chaotic movements while her own aircraft struggled in the thin air at extreme altitude. The prototype seemed to be cycling through different flight modes, sometimes flying normally, sometimes hovering impossibly in midair, sometimes accelerating at rates that should have torn it apart. Negative, unpredictable flight path. Aurora's gravitational systems appear to be cycling randomly between different operational modes. The aircraft is essentially out of control. A massive lightning strike suddenly illuminated the entire sky, revealing Aurora's position less than 2 miles away. In that brief moment of visibility, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. Aurora wasn't just out of control, it was beginning to break apart. Pieces of the aircraft's outer skin were peeling away, and one of the wing sections showed visible structural damage. Phoenix Control, Aurora is experiencing structural failure. I can see pieces of the aircraft separating during flight. The silence from ground control lasted nearly 30 seconds before Colonel Brennan's voice came through the communication system. Angel 7, if Aurora suffers catastrophic structural failure at its current altitude, the debris field could extend for hundreds of square miles. We need you to attempt emergency contact immediately. Sarah pushed her T-38 toward Aurora's last known position, while fighting waves of vertigo that were becoming more severe as the medication wore off. Her depth perception was deteriorating rapidly, making it difficult to judge distances accurately. In the stormy darkness, Major Rodriguez, is there any way to remotely shut down Aurora's gravitational systems? If the field generators are causing the structural problems, eliminating them might stabilize the aircraft. Negative, Angel 7. Aurora's systems are designed to prevent external interference for security reasons. The only way to shut down the gravitational generators is from inside the aircraft's cockpit. Sarah felt a familiar chill as she realized what Rodriguez was suggesting. Someone would need to board Aurora and manually shut down the malfunctioning systems, task that would require the successful completion of the aircraft transfer that had already failed once. Phoenix Control. My fuel reserves are reaching critical levels. I have approximately 15 minutes of flight time remaining before mandatory return to base. Understood, Angel 7. But we need you to know that Aurora's current trajectory will take it over the Denver metropolitan area in approximately 40 minutes. If the aircraft suffers structural failure over populated areas, the implications didn't need to be stated. Aurora's debris, including potentially dangerous radioactive materials from its exotic propulsion systems, could cause casualties and environmental damage on a massive scale. Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible 3 years earlier when she was grounded for medical reasons. She was going to attempt the aircraft transfer again, despite her deteriorating condition and Aurora's structural problems. Phoenix Control. I'm going to make another attempt at docking with Aurora. If I can transfer into the prototype's cockpit, I might be able to shut down the malfunctioning systems manually. Angel 7. Aurora's erratic flight behavior makes docking extremely dangerous. The aircraft could collide with your T-38 during the transfer attempt. I understand the risks, Control. But the alternative is allowing Aurora to break apart over Denver. I have to try. Sarah maneuvered her T-38 toward Aurora's position while fighting both the storm and her own medical condition. The anti-vertigo medication was almost completely ineffective now, leaving her vulnerable to the disorientation that had ended her flying career 3 years earlier. Through the storm clouds, she could see Aurora's navigation lights flickering erratically as the aircraft cycled through its various malfunction modes. Sometimes the prototype flew normally, sometimes it hovered motionless, and sometimes it accelerated at impossible rates. Timing the docking attempt would require predicting Aurora's behavior patterns. Angel 7. I'm reading unusual energy signatures from Aurora's position, the ground controller reported. The aircraft's gravitational systems may be building toward some kind of cascade failure. Sarah didn't need technical explanations to understand that Aurora was becoming increasingly unstable. She could see the evidence with her own eyes as pieces of the aircraft structure continued to separate. During flight, whatever was happening to Aurora's gravitational generators was tearing the aircraft apart from the inside. During a brief moment when Aurora's flight stabilized, Sarah positioned her T-38 beneath the prototype and attempted to dock with the emergency access port. The mechanical connection engaged successfully, but immediately began experiencing stress as Aurora's gravitational fields fluctuated wildly. Docking connection established, but the structural loads are extreme, Sarah reported while fighting to maintain control of both aircraft. Aurora's field fluctuations are creating forces that exceed the docking collar's design limits. Angel 7, you need to transfer immediately, Dr. Chun urged. Your medical telemetry shows severe stress responses, and Aurora's instability is increasing rapidly. Sarah began the emergency egress procedure from her T-38 while the docking tunnel pressurized. The transfer between aircraft would need to be completed in less than 60 seconds to minimize exposure to the extreme altitude and violent weather conditions. As she opened the T-38's canopy, Sarah was immediately struck by the realization that she was about to leave the relative safety of a familiar aircraft for an experimental prototype that was literally breaking apart around her. The sound of Aurora's structural stress was audible even over the storm, metallic groaning and occasional sharp cracks that suggested imminent failure. Phoenix Control, beginning aircraft transfer now. Sarah moved through the pressurized tunnel, connecting the two aircraft while Aurora continued its erratic flight behavior. The tunnel flexed and twisted as gravitational forces warped the space around both aircraft, creating disorienting effects that would have been impossible to imagine before experiencing Aurora's technology firsthand. Halfway through the tunnel, Aurora suddenly inverted, hanging upside down relative to Sarah's T-38. The gravitational forces within the tunnel shifted violently, slamming Sarah against the tunnel walls and threatening to break the connection between aircraft. Angel 7. Aurora just performed an impossible maneuver. The aircraft is now inverted while maintaining level flight attitude. Sarah struggled to complete the transfer while the tunnel continued flexing around her. Aurora's gravitational manipulation was creating localized distortions in spacetime that affected everything within several hundred feet of the aircraft. The laws of physics seemed to be suggestions rather than absolute rules. Almost to Aurora's cockpit, Sarah reported while fighting through another wave of severe vertigo. The combination of Aurora's gravitational effects and her own medical condition was creating disorientation unlike anything she'd experienced. Sarah finally reached Aurora's cockpit and discovered that the interior was unlike any aircraft she'd ever seen. Instead of conventional instruments, the entire cockpit was filled with holographic displays that seemed to respond to the pilot's thoughts rather than physical controls. The pilot's seat was surrounded by a complex array of sensors that apparently monitored the occupant's biological functions in real time. "I'm in Aurora's cockpit, but these controls are completely unfamiliar," Sarah reported while trying to identify systems that might shut down the malfunctioning gravitational generators. Angel 7, look for a red holographic display marked Gravitational Field Management, Major Rodriguez instructed. That should be the primary control interface for the field generators. Sarah found the display Rodriguez had described, but the holographic controls were responding erratically to her inputs. The gravitational field management system showed multiple critical errors, and several field generators were operating at dangerous power levels. "I found the gravitational controls, but the system shows cascade failures throughout the field generator network. It looks like the generators are feeding energy back into each other in an unstable loop. Angel 7, you need to execute an emergency shutdown of all gravitational systems immediately," Rodriguez replied urgently. The cascade failure could result in a localized gravitational anomaly that would be catastrophic. Sarah located what appeared to be an emergency shutdown control, but activating it would eliminate Aurora's ability to fly. The aircraft would become a conventional jet without its gravitational advantages, assuming the shutdown didn't cause immediate structural failure. Phoenix Control, shutting down Aurora's gravitational systems will eliminate the aircraft's primary flight capabilities. We'll be flying a conventional aircraft that wasn't designed for conventional aerodynamics. Angel 7, that's a risk we have to take. Aurora's current condition is unsustainable. Sarah activated the emergency shutdown sequence while bracing herself for Aurora's reaction. The holographic displays flickered and died as the gravitational field generators powered down one by one. The immediate effect was dramatic. Aurora's erratic flight behavior ceased, replaced by conventional aerodynamic flight that felt almost primitive after experiencing gravitational manipulation. But the shutdown also revealed the extent of Aurora's structural damage. Without gravitational fields to compensate for stress loads, the aircraft's weakened structure began failing more rapidly. Warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit as multiple systems reported critical damage. Gravitational shutdown complete, but Aurora has suffered extensive structural damage, Sarah reported while fighting to maintain control of the wounded aircraft. I'm not sure this bird can make it back to Thunderbird Academy. Angel 7, you need to attempt an emergency landing immediately. Aurora's structural integrity is degrading rapidly. Sarah looked out through Aurora's damaged canopy at the storm raging around her. The aircraft was flying on conventional power now, but its exotic design made it inherently unstable without gravitational assistance. Landing Aurora during the storm would require flying skills she wasn't sure she possessed, especially with her deteriorating medical condition. But for the first time in 3 years, Captain Sarah Mitchell was flying again. And she was going to get this aircraft safely on the ground, no matter what it took. Aurora handled like a drunk elephant trying to waltz. Without its gravitational field generators, the experimental aircraft revealed its fundamental design flaw. It had never been intended to fly using conventional aerodynamics alone. Sarah fought the unresponsive controls while descending through the storm's most violent layers, each wind shear threatening to tear apart Aurora's already compromised structure. Holographic displays had been replaced by basic emergency instrumentation that provided minimal flight information. Sarah's airspeed indicator fluctuated wildly between readings that couldn't possibly be accurate, while the altitude display showed a concerning rate of descent that suggested Aurora was falling more than flying. Phoenix control, Aurora's conventional flight characteristics are extremely poor, Sarah reported while wrestling with the aircraft's tendency to roll unpredictably. The airframe wasn't designed for normal aerodynamic flight. It's like trying to fly a brick with wings. Angel 7, we're tracking your position on radar now that Aurora's stealth systems are offline. Major Rodriguez replied, you're currently 37 miles southwest of Thunderbird Academy, but your descent rate is too steep for a normal approach. Sarah checked her remaining fuel and felt her stomach drop. Aurora's backup power systems were consuming fuel at an alarming rate, and the damaged airframe was creating significantly more drag than the aircraft's designers had anticipated. She had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining. Control, I need immediate weather updates for Thunderbird's runway. What are the current wind conditions? Angel 7, surface winds are gusting between 45 and 70 knots with severe crosswind components, the tower controller responded. Visibility is less than 1 mile due to heavy precipitation. Runway conditions are marginal for conventional aircraft operations. The landing would be a nightmare under the best circumstances. Aurora's unusual configuration meant that Sarah couldn't rely on standard approach procedures or familiar handling characteristics. She would need to learn how to land an experimental aircraft while simultaneously battling the worst weather conditions she'd ever encountered. Dr. Chien's voice cut through the radio chatter with obvious concern. Angel 7, your medical telemetry shows increasing stress responses and irregular brainwave patterns. Are you experiencing vertigo symptoms? Sarah was experiencing vertigo, but admitting it would likely result in orders to abort the mission. The medication had worn off completely, leaving her vulnerable to the disorientation that had ended her flying career. But she was the only person who could land Aurora, and the alternative was watching the prototype crash. Negative on significant medical symptoms control. Just dealing with an unfamiliar aircraft in challenging conditions. The lie came easily, practiced through 3 years of concealing her condition from medical evaluators. But the truth was that Sarah was fighting waves of dizziness that made it difficult to interpret her instruments accurately. The storm's turbulence combined with Aurora's erratic handling to create sensory inputs that overwhelmed her damaged inner ear. Angel 7, be advised that emergency vehicles are positioning around Thunderbird's runway, Colonel Brennan announced. Fire and rescue teams are standing by for crash response if needed. Sarah didn't find the information reassuring. Emergency vehicles suggested that even ground control expected Aurora's landing attempt to end in disaster. The prototype aircraft had already exceeded every safety margin, and asking it to perform a controlled landing in severe weather might be impossible. Through the storm clouds, Sarah caught her first glimpse of Thunderbird Academy's runway lights. The facility looked impossibly small from Aurora's perspective, a thin strip of illumination surrounded by darkness. The runway that had seemed adequate for routine training operations now appeared ridiculously inadequate for an experimental aircraft with unknown landing characteristics. "Beginning approach to runway 27, Sarah announced while configuring Aurora for landing. The aircraft systems responded sluggishly to her inputs, and several critical functions showed error messages that she couldn't interpret. Aurora's approach speed was completely unknown. The aircraft's design specifications assumed gravitational assistance for landing operations, but conventional landing procedures had never been tested. Sarah was forced to estimate approach speeds based on Aurora's apparent weight and the limited aerodynamic data her instruments provided. At 5 miles from the runway, Aurora encountered a massive downdraft that sent the aircraft plummeting toward the desert floor. Sarah pulled back on the controls with everything she had, but Aurora's response was delayed and insufficient. The aircraft lost 2,000 feet of altitude in less than 30 seconds. Angel 7, radar shows you've dropped below the glide path. Are you able to maintain controlled flight? Sarah fought to arrest Aurora's descent while her vision blurred from another bout of severe vertigo. The aircraft's nose finally came up, but she had lost critical altitude that would make the runway approach even more challenging. Control, Aurora is responding to inputs but with significant delays. The aircraft's handling characteristics are unlike anything in my experience. What Sarah didn't mention was that her own responses were becoming unreliable. The vertigo episodes were lasting longer and occurring more frequently, leaving her disoriented during critical phases of flight. She was flying on instinct and muscle memory while her inner ear provided conflicting information about Aurora's attitude and movement. At 3 miles from touchdown, Sarah realized that Aurora was approaching too fast and too high for a normal landing. The aircraft's unconventional aerodynamics meant that standard approach procedures were ineffective. She would need to develop new techniques on the fly while fighting both the storm and her own medical condition. Phoenix Control, I'm going to attempt a non-standard approach using Aurora's unconventional flight characteristics, Sarah announced. The aircraft may behave unpredictably during the final approach. Angel 7, what do you mean by non-standard approach? Sarah didn't have time to explain that she was essentially making up landing procedures as she went along. Aurora's design suggested that it might be capable of near-vertical approaches if she could manage the aircraft's exotic aerodynamics correctly. I'm going to try a steep approach angle that conventional aircraft couldn't achieve. Aurora's design might allow approach profiles that would be impossible for normal jets. Sarah pushed Aurora into a descent angle that would have been suicidal in a conventional aircraft. The prototype responded by demonstrating flight characteristics that seemed to ignore basic aerodynamic principles. Instead of stalling at the extreme angle of attack, Aurora maintained controlled flight while descending at nearly 60 degrees. Angel 7, your approach angle exceeds safe parameters for any known aircraft, the tower controller warned urgently. Roger, control. Aurora isn't a known aircraft. The unconventional approach was working, but it required constant attention to prevent Aurora from transitioning into an uncontrolled dive. Sarah's hands moved continuously across the holographic controls while she fought through vertigo episodes that threatened to completely disorient her. At 1 mile from touchdown, Aurora's engines began showing signs of fuel starvation. The aircraft's exotic propulsion systems required specific fuel mixture ratios that were being disrupted by the damaged fuel delivery systems. Engine power fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes surging to dangerous levels and sometimes dropping to barely operational output. Engine anomalies detected, Sarah reported while adjusting thrust settings that seemed to have no correlation to conventional aircraft procedures. Aurora's propulsion systems are becoming unstable. Dr. Chun's voice carried desperation as she monitored Sarah's deteriorating medical condition. Angel 7, your brainwave patterns show severe disorientation, consistent with acute vertigo. You need to consider aborting the landing attempt. Sarah ignored the medical advice while configuring Aurora for the final approach. Aborting the landing would mean attempting another approach with even less fuel, or watching Aurora crash in the desert. Neither option was acceptable. Tower, Angel 7 is on final approach. Emergency vehicles should be prepared for immediate response. The runway lights appeared through Aurora's damaged canopy as distorted streaks of illumination that provided little useful visual reference. Sarah's depth perception was severely compromised, making it nearly impossible to judge her height above the runway surface accurately. Aurora crossed the runway threshold at twice the normal approach speed while descending at an angle that would have destroyed any conventional aircraft. The prototype's unconventional design allowed the extreme approach, but landing at such speeds would test the aircraft's structural limits and Sarah's ability to maintain control. Angel 7, you're coming in extremely fast. Can you reduce approach speed? Negative, Tower. This is Aurora's minimum controllable airspeed in current configuration. Sarah pulled back on the controls as Aurora's main landing gear touched the runway with tremendous force. The impact sent shockwaves through the aircraft's already damaged structure, and she could hear metal components failing throughout the airframe. Aurora bounced back into the air after the initial touchdown, climbing nearly 50 feet before Sarah could force the aircraft back toward the runway. The second impact was even more violent, causing visible sparks as damaged components scraped against the concrete surface. Gear contact, attempting to maintain runway alignment, Sarah reported while fighting Aurora's tendency to veer toward the runway's edge. The aircraft's damaged systems made directional control extremely difficult. Aurora's speed was still dangerously high as it rolled down the runway, and the aircraft's conventional braking systems were inadequate for the experimental jet's mass and velocity. Sarah activated every braking mechanism she could find while praying that Aurora's structure would hold together long enough to stop. Emergency vehicles raced alongside Aurora as the aircraft gradually decelerated, their lights creating a surreal escort for humanity's most advanced flying machine. Sarah could see fire trucks and ambulances positioning themselves for immediate response if Aurora suffered catastrophic failure during the landing roll. With less than 500 feet of runway remaining, Aurora finally came to a complete stop. The aircraft sat motionless on the concrete while steam rose from its overheated braking systems and damaged engines. For the first time in what felt like hours, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she had successfully completed the impossible mission. Angel 7 is stopped on runway 27, she announced while shutting down Aurora's remaining systems. Aircraft are secure, pilots are conscious and responsive. The relief in Dr. Chun's voice was obvious as she responded. Angel 7. Medical teams are approaching your position. Remain in the aircraft until we can ensure safe egress. Sarah slumped back in Aurora's pilot seat while emergency personnel surrounded the experimental aircraft. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion and lingering vertigo, but she had accomplished what everyone believed was impossible. She had intercepted a runaway experimental aircraft, transferred between jets during a storm, and landed a prototype that had never been designed for conventional flight operations. As medical teams prepared to extract her from Aurora's cockpit, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. 3 years ago, she had been grounded for medical reasons that supposedly made her unsuitable for military flying. Tonight, those same medical issues had nearly prevented her from saving Aurora and potentially preventing a disaster that could have affected thousands of people. The instructor who had been told she'd never fly again had just piloted the world's most advanced aircraft through the worst storm in recent memory. And despite everything that had gone wrong, she had brought both herself and Aurora home safely. The debriefing room at Thunderbird Academy buzzed with activity as technical specialists documented every detail of Aurora's emergency landing. Sarah sat in a medical chair while Dr. Chun completed her post-mission evaluation, studying readouts that showed the full extent of Sarah's physiological stress during the flight. 3 days had passed since the mission, and the medical data was revealing information that would reshape everyone's understanding of pilot limitations. Captain Mitchell, your medical telemetry during the Aurora flight shows something extraordinary, Dr. Chun announced while reviewing the data streams. Despite experiencing severe vertigo episodes, your motor control and decision-making remained remarkably precise. Your brain somehow compensated for the inner ear dysfunction through enhanced visual processing and spatial reasoning. Colonel Brennan entered the room carrying a classified folder that contained preliminary analysis of Aurora's systems and Sarah's performance during the emergency. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated significant news. Captain, I have the initial findings from the Aurora incident investigation, Brennan began. The aircraft suffered no permanent damage despite the structural stress of conventional flight operations. More importantly, your handling of the emergency has led to several breakthrough discoveries about human adaptation to exotic flight systems. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Aurora's survival meant that humanity's most advanced aircraft could continue development, but she wondered what the investigation had revealed about her own performance during the mission. Sir, what kind of discoveries? Major Rodriguez joined the group carrying technical readouts that showed detailed analysis of Aurora's flight characteristics during both gravitational and conventional operations. Captain, your unconscious adaptations to Aurora's systems provided data that we couldn't have obtained through normal test procedures. Your brain developed compensation techniques that allow humans to interface more effectively with gravitational flight technology. The implications were staggering. Sarah's medical condition, which had been considered a disqualifying factor for flight operations, had actually provided insights that could revolutionize pilot training for next-generation aircraft. Major, are you saying that my inner ear damage somehow helped me fly Aurora more effectively? Not exactly, Rodriguez replied thoughtfully. But your brain's adaptation to compensate for vertigo created neural pathways that made you more receptive to Aurora's unconventional sensory inputs. Normal pilots rely heavily on inner ear feedback, which conflicts with gravitational flight systems. Your reduced reliance on inner ear data allowed you to process Aurora's flight characteristics more intuitively. Dr. Chun looked up from her medical analysis with obvious excitement. Captain, we're seeing evidence that pilots with certain types of inner ear adaptations might actually be better suited for advanced aircraft systems. Your condition wasn't a limitation, it was a specialized capability. The revelation turned 3 years of perceived disability into a unique qualification. Sarah had spent years believing that her accident had ended her flying career, when in reality it had prepared her for aircraft that didn't yet exist. Colonel, what does this mean for my medical status? Brennan opened his classified folder and reviewed documents that would determine Sarah's future in military aviation. Captain Mitchell, based on your performance during the Aurora emergency and the medical insights gained from the mission, the Medical Review Board has recommended a complete reevaluation of your flight status. Sarah felt her heart race as she waited for the decision that would either restore her flying career or confirm her permanent grounding. The board's conclusion is that your medical condition, properly managed, actually enhances your capability to pilot experimental aircraft with unconventional flight characteristics. You're being cleared for full flight operations with a specialization in advanced systems testing. The words took several seconds to register fully. After 3 years of being grounded, Sarah was not only being returned to flight status, she was being assigned to the most advanced aircraft development programs in military history. Sir, does this mean I'll be working with Aurora's continued development? Captain, you're being assigned as Aurora's primary test pilot, Brennan announced. The aircraft performed better under your control than it had during any previous flight operations. The engineering team wants to understand how your unique neural adaptations interface with gravitational flight systems. Major Rodriguez activated a display showing Aurora's updated configuration recommendations. We're modifying Aurora's control systems based on data from your flight. The aircraft will incorporate adaptive interfaces that can adjust to different pilot neurological profiles, potentially making gravitational flight accessible to a broader range of pilots. Sarah studied the technical modifications while processing the dramatic change in her circumstances. 3 days ago, she had been a grounded instructor watching others pursue their flying dreams. Now she was being offered the opportunity to help develop humanity's next evolutionary step in aviation. Colonel, what about my teaching responsibilities? My students still need instruction. Captain, your teaching experience will be invaluable for training the next generation of experimental aircraft pilots, Brennan replied. We're establishing a new program that combines conventional flight instruction with preparation for advanced systems. You'll be developing the curriculum that bridges the gap between current aircraft and future technology. Dr. Chun completed her final medical assessment and turned to face Sarah directly. Captain, I want you to understand that this assignment comes with unique risks. Gravitational flight systems are still experimental, and we're learning about their effects on human physiology as we go. You'll essentially be a pioneer in a completely new field of aviation medicine. Sarah considered the risks while looking at the technical specifications for Aurora's upgraded systems. Every advance in aviation had required pilots willing to push beyond known boundaries and accept dangers that others considered unacceptable. Doctor, 3 years ago, I thought my flying career was over. If there's a chance to contribute to humanity's future in flight, I'm willing to accept the risks. There's one more thing, Brennan added. The Aurora program is being expanded based on the success of your emergency mission. We're developing a squadron of gravitational aircraft with you as the squadron commander. You'll be responsible for training pilots and developing operational procedures for technology that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. The offer exceeded Sarah's wildest expectations. Not only was she being returned to flight status, but she was being given command responsibility for the most advanced aviation program in human history. Sir, I accept the assignment. When do we begin? Immediately, Rodriguez replied. Aurora's next test flight is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and we have 6 additional pilots arriving next week for initial gravitational flight training. You'll be their instructor. As the meeting concluded, Sarah walked outside to the flight line, where Aurora sat in its hangar, surrounded by technicians preparing for the next phase of testing. The experimental aircraft looked different, now not like an alien machine, but like a tool that she understood and could control. Jennifer Williams, her former student, approached from the direction of the flight simulators, the young cadets. Expression showed a mixture of awe and confusion as she processed the dramatic changes in her instructor's status. Captain Mitchell, is it true that you're going to be flying Aurora regularly now? Sarah smiled at the question that represented everything she had gained and lost over the past few days. That's right, Cadet Williams. And if you're interested in advanced systems training, you might have the opportunity to learn gravitational flight techniques yourself. Jennifer's eyes widened with excitement. You mean students could learn to fly aircraft like Aurora? Eventually, Sarah replied. We're developing training programs that will prepare pilots for aircraft that haven't been built yet. The future of aviation is going to require pilots who can adapt to technologies we're just beginning to understand. As Sarah walked toward Aurora's hangar, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, an accident had ended one phase of her flying career. Tonight, an emergency had begun another phase that promised to be more challenging and rewarding than anything she had previously experienced. The thought the instructor who had been told she'd never fly again was about to become humanity's guide into a new era of aviation. Her students had always been taught that aircraft wanted to fly, and that a pilot's job was to guide rather than fight. Now Sarah would be teaching pilots to guide aircraft that redefined the very concept of flight itself. Captain Sarah Mitchell had finally come home to the sky, and this time she was bringing the future with her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.